The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name, from a Greek word Deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are two outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into two parts themselves. Let's just dive in and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses, first of all, summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the 10 Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says, how? Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation: the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors, and it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so two, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law, and you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9, and he quotes a law from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses says this. He says, "I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile." Which is kind of a downer. But then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile, at any point, Moses says they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then of blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
Well, I was stirred by that as we watched it, given the context of the entirety of the Torah and the difference that that makes. Um, just hearing some of the verses that they pulled out, it reminds me that how often we hear the same drab comment. The Old Testament and the God that's spoken above in the Old Testament seems so different than the God of the New Testament. And I'm ready to just tell people when they say that, it seems like the God of the Old Testament is different. I'm ready to start telling people, well, then you just haven't read your Bible. Because we see here how he was talking about circumcising the heart, what Paul said in the book of Romans, how he's calling people to obedience, he's calling people to worship, he's calling people to relationship. That was happening then. All they hear, though, when they think of the Old Testament, especially the Torah, is the law. And they say, well, it's just strict, it's rules, it's regulations, it's stiffness because we've got to live a certain way. When the reality was, he said, I'm calling you to better life. I'm calling you to abundant life. And this is how you have abundant life. We look to the New Testament and we see, well, it's just boiled down to love God and love your neighbor. Well, love are action verbs, and there's something that must be done for love. You can't just say, I love you, and there's no proof. Because saying I love you is not proof, because I can say a lot of things. But where's the proof? I own the largest camel in the world. Where's the camel? Well, he's at the doctor. Until we see it, there's no belief. So there has to be proof to those actions, and it spoke of here, and I like how we will get to it, and I'm trying not to get ahead, how some of these words that we hear have much deeper meanings, and we'll get to that, at least hopefully, around chapter 6. But let's start with our basics that we've done so much of our time. Let's talk about the overview of Deuteronomy. The author of it, we know, is Moses for the most part, because remember, we have to say for the most part, because what happens in this book that disqualifies him from writing some of it? What keeps him from writing the entirety of Deuteronomy? He dies. And he didn't keep writing after he died. No. So we know that Moses wrote the majority of it. And it is just kind of assumed that maybe Joshua finished it. Others could have helped. We don't fully know. But the authorship is attributed to Moses for the most part. The date of existence of this writing is assumed to be around 1400 BC. It's 1406 on the screen. I've told you before, 6 years is not going to make me freak out when it comes to some of these deep archaeological things. We'll get to that more in a moment.
So that's the number one is the 1406.
Yeah, when did the events of Deuteronomy occur? About 1406, about 1400 BC, 1406 BC. And that even comes with an asterisk because remember, Moses is recounting some of the time of things that happened from the book of Exodus to the book of Numbers. But when he's going through these speeches, when he's making these statements, it's all happening around the same time, around the same location. He's giving all these speeches, talking about history to the Israelites that occurred from really from Genesis to Numbers. So about 1406. What is the Hebrew name for Deuteronomy? And I should have wrote what is the Greek name because we call it by the Greek name, and by saying Deuteronomy, which means the second law, the second expounding of the law. But the Hebrew name is These Are the Words, which is kind of how we got our Sunday morning sermon series titled These Are Listen to the Words. But the book in Hebrew translate These Are the Words, which if you start from the very beginning, verse 1, the words of Moses is how this book starts. So it starts with essentially the name of the book, the words of Moses. These are the words of Moses. Yeah, and so that's what we get for the book of Deuteronomy in terms of what we need to know about it in a nutshell. To look at this outline, like I said, this is the biggest outline we've done for any one of the single books of Deuteronomy. And as I've said before, if you've got your small book, if you look it up online, you're going to find a different outline every place you look. I used about 3 or 4 outlines plus just reading the book myself to kind of develop an outline for you. But to go through it for what I'm presenting to you, Book of Deuteronomy is outlined for us in 4 major and 18 smaller divisions. So you can kind of chop these up. You saw on the screen and on your map, they use about 3 divisions. I broke it down into 4. No one's right, no one's wrong. It's just how we choose to study it. For us, though, I'm submitting to you Major Unit 1. It covers chapters 1 through most of chapter 4, and it is simply remembrance and renewal. And you see that as you go through because the book starts with them reiterating the command to leave Mount Horeb, or out in the Sinai Peninsula. They're called to leave Mount Horeb to go out and towards the Promised Land. Leaders are appointed towards the end of the middle of chapter 1. Then we learn Moses recounts about the sending of the spies. We learned how Israel rebelled. And then in chapter 2, it goes into the wilderness years. This is all, as it puts there on the screen, point A, the recent history of Israel. He's recounting everything that's kind of happened from Mount Horeb until that present day when he's speaking to him. He doesn't go back all the way to Egypt. He just starts at the covenantal law. When God gave them the law on Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, remember that's the same thing, he said, let's start there in my speech. From there until now, I'm going to go through this systematic, routine rotation of rebellion that you've had. We sent spies. You rebelled. We were in the wilderness. We saw victory in the wilderness. We saw the King Sihon be defeated. We saw King Og defeated. We saw victory in the land with the division. and we saw yet more rebellion. Um, so that's the recent history of Israel. And then in chapter 4, for the part that fits this unit, is a call to covenant faithfulness or covenantal faithfulness. I think I just wrote covenant because it was a space issue on my end. A call to covenant faithfulness. And this is from chapter 4, verse 1 through 43. Moses commands obedience in the first part. He speaks on idolatry in the middle, and just sets essentially this law, and also talks about cities of refuge towards the end of this section, verses 41 through 43. Which, what are the cities of refuge? Remember, that was a place for anyone to seek refuge that had accidentally taken the life of another individual. And this was not first degree murder. This was not even murder in of itself. It was you're working together building a house and I accidentally dropped a stone on your head and you passed away. I go to the city of refuge so that the person that passed away's cousin, brother, mother, whatever, doesn't come to take my life because it was an accident. It covered this kind of grace period for those types of incidences where it was strictly accidental. Now, if there was intent, yeah, the law was clear. If you intentionally take another man's life, your life is to be taken. But for these gray areas where it was solemnly just an accident, so that those who lost someone wouldn't seek revenge, there was places of safe havens, these refuge cities, and that becomes even more important down the line too. I find the city of refuge idea beautiful, that God sought to make this provision because he saw that in humanity there was opportunity for these incidents to occur and that people might need a place of refuge. And that's really the first major unit. I almost wanted to call this a minor unit because it was only 3.5 chapters. It wasn't even the full first 4 chapters, because the last few verses of chapter 4 are in the beginning of the next unit. And that next unit is the statutes and judgments of Israel. This is where I divided away from your map. If you look, they include chapter 4 through 11 in Moses' opening speech. And while that is true too, it also includes a lot of the laws and judgments for Israel. It starts in the first few verses left of chapter 4 and verse 44 through 49, where it talks about the introduction to the law, which is why I wanted to include it in this section. After the introduction to the law, what we studied together already on Sunday morning in chapter 5 is the recounting and the reiteration of the 10 Commandments. Now, I take certain umbrage with the name of Deuteronomy being the second law, because for us today, when we hear second law, it's almost like a sequel. That's the second movie in the franchise. That's the second book in the series. It's the second son, right? That person had 2 sons. They had the first son and a second son. So we have this concept of when we hear second law to separate it. And that's not true. When they were writing here in Deuteronomy, this was not a new law. It was not a separate law. It was not a superseding law. It was just a reiteration of what had already been established. It was expounding upon what already existed. It wasn't bringing in something else and saying, "Oh, we've already messed up the first one. Here's the second one. Let's stick to it." It was, here's what we said 40 years ago on top of Mount Sinai, and now that we've gone through the wilderness and we're waiting here, I want to make sure you still remember it, because can you forget something in 40 years? I can, and I'm 33. So, proof of concept.
I have it here as it's a book of transition to the new generation.
It certainly is, because they, in Numbers, that was in the wilderness period, that all those at Mount Sinai who were like scoffing and repulsing, when God said, "This generation will not enter in," that's why it took 2 generations of wandering for those to pass away, and everyone that was 20 and under, lived. And so he's giving this law almost to a new generation of people. While they were alive, some of them, he's making sure that these 15-year-olds that were there at Mount Sinai that are now 45 or 55 are set before they go over. Because we've already seen it be said, I'm giving this to you now because the wilderness was a time for you to get grounded before you go into this land of plenty and lose your mind. It's that same responsibility. We don't give the kid who just started driving the keys to the Corvette, right? Sorry. Uh, we don't give the $300,000 car to the teenager who has no experience. What do we buy them? The $3,000 car, the used one, right? Because we want them to be proven responsible so that when they come in contact with something of much greater value, they can handle it. Which I had one pastor say, now think about that when it comes to dating. It may change how you think about dating, and that's not for tonight. Why you wouldn't hand over the keys to your $300,000 car. Why would you hand over the keys to your daughter? I'm glad I'm hearing this when Judy's 3.
$300,000 car.
No, that's true too. Um, but he wanted to teach them in the desert while there was nothing to rely on God, so that when they got into the land of everything, they would still rely on God. We know that it didn't work, but he still sought to teach them. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, okay, we see on the screen 4 through 40, 40 through 49 was the introduction to the law. Chapter 5, general summarization is the Ten Commandments. And then in chapter 6, we talk about the greatest commandment. And that's where we get to that thing we've heard before, mentioned it this morning, the Shema, which is really just the Hebrew word that you see in verse 4 and 5 of, which I think it might be on the screen. In Deuteronomy 6, chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, we see that, hear, O Israel. It's the same way chapter 9 started today, this morning, right? Hear, O Israel. That hear is the word Shema. That's just how it's pronounced in Hebrew. We see that here. This is where we get that listen and love the Lord alone. That's a grand boiling down of what we would call the commandment here, or this writing, because in practicing Judaism, it's more than just these two verses. You have verses 4 through 9. There's a set of verses from chapter 11 and a set of verses, I think, from the book of Numbers, if I'm remembering it correctly, that all make up and consist what they call the whole Shema today. And so it's all these three passages put together to make up this memorization of what should be the core thought for us in our relationship with God. Because this is the exact verse Jesus later used when he said, what is the greatest commandment? You've got tons of them. Jesus, you're a great teacher. What is the greatest commandment? He said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your spirit. This is the first and greatest commandment. And we get that from this passage here when it said, listen, O Israel, hear, listen. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. He is God alone. That is to say, to what they said on the video. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be in your heart. This was that concept of loving the Lord. It started with listening. Listen to the Lord, love the Lord alone. And that listen, and this is something, so y'all don't get everything, and I hate it. Because when we got home, we ate lunch, and then me and Sydney talked about the sermon for the next 2 hours. And I said, I wish we could have just had all of this up at the church. Because there was things that, like, I didn't get to in the sermon this morning. I was like, I wish I did have. I wish I did have. That's not a word. I wish I would have. I wish I would have thought I could have had time to do so. Because we didn't get really to how the obey coalesces with action. This remembrance that we talked about, remember, listen, understand, remember. In that remembrance, it was partnered with action. Just as we've already mentioned tonight, love is proven how? Not with word, but with action. Well, the same thing with God. Obedience is not proven by word, it's proven by action. Love, listening, responding, remembering, is not proven by thoughts and words alone, it's proven by action. And the great example that was given was if someone said, I remembered your birthday, and it was 5 days ago, and you didn't hear from them, they may have thought of it, but they didn't really remember it. What do we do every September 11th? We say what? Never forget. Let's remember. What are we remembering? We're stopping to put our minds on that horrible event that happened in 2001. We're reflecting on it. We're going back to it. Now, some people do a lot more. They have ceremonies. They have actions. And they're, showing what? Remembrance. Well, that's the terminology we still use. It's still in our vernacular, but sometimes remember is just boiled down to a thought. And that's not what this is portraying. These are actions, not just thoughts. Listening to the Lord was the willingness to respond and obey. Loving the Lord was a willingness to devote and make this decision to surrender. And it came with actions. And I know that we did read Ephesians 2 this morning, and we talked there at the end of verse 10 about how we are created for work. When we were renewed and born again, we're done so for the sake of working. And it's not strenuous work. It's building the kingdom of God here as it already is. And I'm about to leave Deuteronomy if I don't stop now. The Shema is beautiful, though. It is a call to remembrance. I've grown personally in reflecting over this. And like I said, the section here, 4 through 9 of chapter 6, that's part of it, and this is also what created the culture. You'll see the most heavy practitioner of Judaism, they'll have the leather bindings around their wrists and around their arms, and the front, the little box that you may see in the images of some, that there's a little box that's strapped to their foreheads. These verses are literally written on miniature scrolls and placed inside of those boxes, because as it says, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, they shall be between the frontlets of your eyes. They take that as a literal thing, and you may scoff and say, well, they're going too far with it. It's not necessary, but if I got a little leather box strapped to my forehead, you know what I'm paying attention to? The little leather box strapped to my forehead. It's just a reminder. I'm not too pressed about people doing that. But there's more beauty to be here, and we could finish the rest of the night doing that, but we're going to stop for now and try to continue with our thing. Chapter 7, beginning in verse 1 through chapter 11, are all these callings for faithfulness and the response of disobedience. Chapter 7, he goes in, and we've gone through this on Sunday morning, some of these, so it's really easy to go through, how they were a chosen people called out of Egypt. In chapter 8, he talks about remembering the Lord, and we've talked about that. In chapter 9, which we covered this morning, I don't have to go too far into that for y'all's sake. I didn't even reference how he referenced the golden calf here in chapter 9, because we had recently gone over it, but that takes its own study as well. He remembers the golden calf here in the middle of chapter 9 and the verses that we didn't cover this morning. Into chapter 10, which we'll start next week, next Sunday morning as well, is the second pair of the tablets that had the law written on them. Remember, he broke the first ones when he came down. They were one tablet, and he broke them in his anger. I've learned in this study, Moses acted out in his anger. Relatable, anybody? He acted out in his anger. He broke stuff. He said words he shouldn't have said. He was a little hothead. Respect, honestly. I feel more relatable to these people in some of these regards. The last half of chapter 10, and this one's interesting to me, is what is entitled the essence of the law. And that's from verse 12 through the end of the chapter, which was mentioned there. There is this idea that the law is one thing, but the essence of the law. What does that mean? The heart behind it, the mentality behind it. Because why do we put speed limits up?
It's the law.
It's the law.
Protection.
Yeah, you don't wanna.
A reminder.
Yeah, if you go too fast around this curve, you're not going to make it. You go too fast on this road, you might hit someone because there's civilians that live here. You know, it's a public street. We put up signs to say warning children in the area because we want people to be aware. We put up speed limits to say, look, we've tested this road. If you go too fast beyond this point, it becomes more dangerous for you to drive. The law of God is the same way. It's not saying like, here is the law. If you fail to observe it completely, you're completely destroyed. It was here's this law, and the essence of it is not to give you this set of rules and regulations that, I'm making you. It was saying, I want to give you abundant life and to give you best life. And living in this standard provides you the best life. If you go beyond this point, you go into dangerous territory. You're getting into places that will hurt you and destroy you and cause harm. And it also talks about in this middle collection, not coelection, this middle collection of laws talks about civil laws and laws about social justice. Because guess what? There's these verses in these passages that we'll come across that gives regulations about how they're to keep and abide the slaves they have. And here's something that people want to argue. Well, the Bible promotes slavery. It doesn't. God never said, make slaves. What God did say is, treat those people well. Here's how. Here's what you do. Here's how you tend to them. Here's how you provide for them. Here's how you bless them. Here's how you let them go. Like every so often, he would say, it's time to release. And beautiful enough, if the servant, because the word slave and servant was the same word, and that's where some things get a little confusing. If that servant, when he was released, said, no, I have it too good here, I want to stay here, they essentially gave him an earring without a stud. They bored a hole in his ear, and it was a sign and signet that I'm saying, I've been freed but chosen to stay. Because who would do that unless you had a really good life? Who would say, I've been working to pay this debt because the concept in some of it was, I owed you money and now I'm going to essentially be your employee until I pay it off. It wasn't some of the slavery that we've seen in other parts of the world. It was indentured servitude. It was, I owe you money. I'm going to work for you. Instead of just paying you money, I'm just going to give you my time and hours instead. And some of those times when that time was up or that money was paid back, it's like, hey, this is a great relationship. I want to keep it that way. And so I'm making this sign, I'm making this commitment to you, and here's my token, my proof, so that when someone says, hey, Jubilee came, you didn't let your servants go. No, I stayed. Here's proof that I chose to stay. Because it was up to the servant to make that choice. He never promoted it, but he gave rules to regulate it for when it happened, which is a whole thing unto itself. Faithfulness and disobedience. Chapter 11 is love and obey. It showed this balance between the two. We do, I think, get one of our verses that I put on here. Yeah. If you look to 11, verse 26 to 28, Moses sets forth two options for Israel. One is a blessing and one is a curse. And he literally says, just see, I'm setting before you this day a blessing and a curse. It's pretty blunt. The blessing is if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am commanding you to this day. And the curse is if you will not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn, he gives the description about what disobedience is, but if you turn from obeying God, if you turn away from the way of God unto other gods, which you have not known. So he gave this divider. He said, if you obey the commandments, there is blessing. But if you disobey, what does disobedience look like? You turn to serve other gods. Even just takes one. If you're turning away from the commandments of the Lord and serving other gods, then you're calling upon a curse to yourself. And that was this section of faithfulness and disobedience that gets you through chapter 11. And this is where, if you look on your papers, from 12 through 18, it's very choppy. From G through J, it's very choppy because you go through these little subsections that are so minute to what they're describing. It's hard to break them apart into any other way. Because if you get to chapter 12 and 13, it's simply about worship. Worship and idolatry, but idolatry is false worship, right? So it's these laws. I don't even like saying that because how we interpret that word today. It's these judgments, these directions about worship and idolatry. What is worship? How to worship? What is idolatry? And what may go out into amongst it. There's some interesting things in here, at least to me. In the middle of chapter 12, we get this. Notwithstanding, you may kill and eat meat. within all your gates, whatever your heart desires, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. The unclean and the clean. Now, wait a minute. Kosher says we can't eat the unclean. Why is it saying here that we can? Because, again, the essence. They were called to be what? Remember, they were called to be set apart. They were called to be an example. And here it says, notwithstanding you may eat, in verse 15 and 16 of chapter 12, you may eat what he has given you. The unclean and the clean, you may eat of it, of the gazelle and of the deer. Only you must not eat the blood. You shall pour it upon the ground like water. Now, we've talked about that before. Why didn't they eat the blood? What was Leviticus saying that was in the blood? Opposite.
Oh, they said life was in it?
Life is in the blood. That through the blood, there is life, because that's what brings oxygen throughout your body. According to science, you breathe in the air, the oxygen gets in your blood. The blood then takes it all throughout your body, because if you've got a limb turning blue, you're not getting oxygen to it. And without that oxygen being garnered to it by the blood, that limb's going to die. You cut off circulation to something, let it lose that circulation long enough, you're keeping the blood from getting to it, that part of your body will die. Whether it's a finger, a toe, a leg, you cut off that circulation, you cut off the flow of blood, it dies. And they're saying here, don't consume the life of another thing. You consume that meat, you pour out the blood. Because we also see what's important in all of the offerings. The blood. There is blood in the offerings. By the blood of Jesus, right, we have life. He poured his blood out so that whosoever will may have life from it. And there was just this grand symbolism through the time. Found that interesting in chapter 12. Like I said, chapter 13 talks about idolatry in many ways, and what is idolatry, what is sin in many other ways, how you treat it when it's in your family, how are you to put yourself away from it, not commit yourself to it. Chapter 14 and 15 go over a series of laws concerning livestock, money, servants, animals, like everything. You start with clean and unclean food, but it really starts, you shall not cut yourself or make any baldness for your eyes for the dead. You are a holy people of the Lord your God, which means you've been set apart. You've been chosen to be a peculiar people to himself, treasured above all nations of the earth. He was calling them to live separately. And remember what they said in the video. Some of these laws won't make sense to us because we live in a culture that has not been defined by every law of Scripture, right? Some of these are like, why is he saying, like, don't do X or don't do Y? Don't mingle your garments together. It was all to show this sense of separation. And this verse here, you are a holy people. You are a people set apart to the Lord your God, for he has chosen you to be a peculiar people to yourself. Peter used this verse later on when he was speaking to believers today, saying, you are a chosen generation. You are a peculiar people. You are a royal priesthood. You're called to be set apart, separate, holy unto the Lord, so that your life is clearly, visibly different than all the other nations, so that when people see you, they recognize that you are not of this world. You're not of any earthly kingdom, but you're of a kingdom of heaven. We should be visibly different. And I'm not talking about we all cut our hair the same way to say we're in church. It's not going to work. I don't think y'all want my haircut, and I don't want some of yours. Some of you, I can't make it go that way. I'm not going to let it get that long. Like, I can't. I've let it get shaggy before. I saw a picture today, and I was like, how did I do that? It was shaggy. I can't. Never mind. I'm going to stop myself before I get in trouble. But we are to be different in our, the Bible, and many times would use the word conversation, lifestyle. We're to be set apart in our lifestyle so that when people see us, they see our works, as Jesus said, that they may glorify your Father which is in heaven. worship and idolatry. Chapter 14, 15, sorry. Livestock, money, servitudes. There's a passage about tithing here. Whole different conversation. Don't have time for tonight. Chapter 15 goes into some of the festivals and things that they would observe. The sabbatical year, the Passover in 16. It also talked about the freeing of servants in chapter 15, which we've already commented on. 16 talks about more of the feast weeks, Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Tabernacles, and also mentions at the end of chapter 16 laws about concerning leadership, which I kind of skipped over there, which is festival and holy days. But that's 16 verses 1 through 17. In 18, it talks about appointing of judges, which if you've heard the book of Judges, this is partly where it's based on. It says here in chapter 16, beginning in verse 18, it talks about the appointing of judges and their position, what they were to be doing. And that finishes nearly the chapter. It says, you must appoint. And notice this wording, because it's, one, an answer in your questions, but two, it's important for us to hear. He says in verse 18 of chapter 16, you must appoint judges. We're going to get something later on that for comparison's sake, it's going to sound a little different. But he says, you must appoint judges and officers at your gates, which was where the common ground of meeting was. When the Lord your God gives you, which the Lord your God gives you throughout your tribes, every tribe was to have judges, every tribe was to have these officers that would regulate the law, that would discern right and wrong based on the law, so that when there were disputes, your ox ate my corn. Well, that's property damage. Let's go over here and talk about it. Let's see what the law says. Let's discern what God declared when something like this happens. Exactly. They were to bring peace through the law, and that's important. They were to bring peace through the law. They would cast judgment, saying here, look, it says, through your gates, throughout your tribes, they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You must not pervert that judgment, nor show partiality, because what does that do? It disrupts the peace balance. Y'all like crooked cops? No, right? That's collective answer. No. You like crooked government officials? No. Why is that? Because it's a distortion of the law of justice. That's what we call it. It's the law of justice. And when there's crooked perversions in that system, it shifts the balance. It becomes skewed, is the word I was trying to say. It becomes skewed so that now whoever's paying in is the beneficiary. And now it becomes a system of, if you have money, you get away with it. But if you're poor and destitute, you don't. And that's the opposite of God's kingdom. Here, this perversion and this separation, and God's kingdom is all about restoring balance and that everyone is equal. Everyone has that same weight of value. You have $1 billion, you're just as worthy as the person who has no dollars. God has that sense of justice. And as we've already gone over some of these laws, these social laws where it's you honor those who are without. It said in the video that every 3 years they were giving 1/10 to the poor. They were setting aside 10% of their income to donate for charity, essentially, in that 1 year, because they wanted to bring this balance and this restoration to those who fell in desolation. And you say, how would people end up poor? Remember the society. A woman has a husband. He is the breadwinner. He dies. There's two options for her, essentially. It's her becoming a servant, or it's her remarrying. And if she is not able to do either of those things, where does she fall? To the bottom of the barrel. And now she has no one to make provision. She has no one to bring justice to her. And we're going to get to it later on. I'm not going to get to it tonight. All right, I'll skip ahead. In my head, I know where it's at, but I'm just going to go. We're going to cover a verse later on in the book of Deuteronomy that this is the heart of God. He says to these three groups, he names them very specifically. He says, these three groups I want you to show no difference to. Do not withhold from them. Do not be partial against them. These three groups. And they were the sojourner, the stranger, the one that was not of Israel, the one who was not a nationalist, the one who was from the outside, the fatherless, and the widow. He names these three specifically because it would be the hardest for them. He said, I want you to honor those who are least among you. Now that's just straight back to the teachings of Jesus. Nothing's changed. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Those who exalt themselves, they shall be brought low. But those who are low shall be exalted. Because I want to bring restoration and this sense of equality amongst my people in my kingdom. So that if you have $1 million, you really have as much as now the person next to you, because you're willing to make that provision. And they're willing to do the same for you. It's an easy concept that we don't see because of a lot of pragmatisms, a lot of hurt that's happened before. Can you imagine if we all put our money in one pot and then said, all right, we're paying everyone's light bill out of this pot? Well, now you essentially, there's 20-ish people in this room. If 19 people are paying your light bill, should you have to worry about your light bill? No. If 19 people are putting food on your table, should you have to worry about food? No, because there's 19 people putting food on their table too. There's 19 other people trying to take care of you. And that's just in this one room. And that's the concept that Jesus was trying to create here. That's the concept God was trying to create through these laws. He's saying there's people that are least among you, that don't have the opportunity, that don't have the provision. Those who have come in, who've accepted the way of God through Israel, through the example they set forth by being a separate people and amongst full of nations who are self-serving, idolistic, and only seeking their own, who are lighting their own children on fire for a sacrifice unto their gods. These people who are so wildly different, if they see you as you follow the law and see how you bless each other and you're a nation separate, unlike anything else, and they want to join in, they're not coming in with inheritance. They're not coming in with a parcel of land because it's been given to you. So they're wanting to join, but they have no place to go. Don't put them on the box on the outside porch and say, well, you can be a part of us in law, but you're not getting any of our stuff. There's no justice there. So show love to those who sojourn. Show love to the strangers, to the outsider coming in. Show love to the fatherless because they have no one to raise them. They got no one to provide for them. They have no one to give and train and establish for them what's being established for others. To the widows, to the description that we've already given, I'm not going to have to reiterate that. These people need the most because they have the least. Seek justice for them. And nothing's changed. Let me quickly, it's up there. So you can write down through K. And that's kind of what we've talked about here. We didn't go over some specifics that we will get to. We'll have to get to next week because there's a topic I want to talk about in chapter 17 that attaches to what we've already discussed. But we'll stop here. We'll pick up chapter 17 next week, which is great news. We got halfway through the book. I'm very actually excited about that. We're halfway through. So it's on track with what I honestly anticipated. Shooting for more, but halfway is good for me. But we'll pick up and we'll finish this next week for sure. And then we got some talking points to go through. Like, doing this is not all encompassing, I know. Any question or comment before we close?